Hello and welcome. I am Esther. I am Peter's AI assistant to create voiceovers. I will simply read Peter's blog posts so that you have a choice of reading the blog post or listening to my voice. Hello and welcome, gentlemen. Firstly, please let me say this. This blog post is very long, so any errors in the translation of text to voice are mine. I have run the blog post through the translation process and checked it, but I could easily have missed one or two words or phrases. So I apologize in advance for any translation errors. Now, on with the blog post. As I have recently announced on my channel, I will be doing some opinion pieces and response videos. In this blog post, I wanted to talk about an excellent blog post my friend Bill Inman recently released. I wanted to use it to talk about the history of data modeling in the data warehousing area. Firstly, I highly recommend you read Bill's blog post. You can read it on the button below. Now, I wanted to talk about the history of data warehousing data models from my experience. By 1989, I was the youngest system architect in IBM Australia. As part of this, I decided to use the newly released source code and library management product that I will call SCLM for short. Also at that time, the IBM Toronto Development Laboratory had a product under development called the Query Business Information System. In May and June 1990, I was selected as one of the youngest people ever to go to the IBM Santa Teresa Laboratory to write what is called a Red Book on SCLM. Much to my surprise, IBM had a development project underway where the eventual name of the product would become the IBM Information Warehouse. This development project was using QBIS as one of its major inputs, and the project manager for QBIS was on assignment to the Santa Teresa Laboratory at the same time. Her name was Christine. Christine and I met at one of the many social events for assignees to the laboratory, and she explained what her team was doing on both QBIS and the Information Warehouse project. The Information Warehouse was to be a third normal form database, as per all standard knowledge at that time. I then followed the development of the IBM Information Warehouse from mid-1990 onwards. In March 1991, I was assigned to my first IBM customer, which was the Mutual Life Company, or MLC for short. A few weeks later, I was attending a meeting where one of my old friends from the IT department was demonstrating the data interpretation system from Metaphor Computer Systems. This was the company that Ralph Kimball co-founded in 1982. IBM had bought shares in it in 1989 and decided to buy the rest of the shares in late 1990. So by January 1991, Metaphor Computer Systems was 100% owned by IBM. Ralph Kimball had left Metaphor Computer Systems in 1989. He has never publicly criticized IBM, but I personally just got the feeling that he did not like how IBM managed its investment, and he decided to move on. I do not know that for sure. That is just my guess, not even strong enough to be called an opinion. As it happened, I was given 90 days to prove that we could do with the data interpretation system, also called DIS, what we promised to our customer. I had no idea how this thing worked, and it was a very hard 90 days, especially given my wife had a baby in the middle of it. I talked to all the people who were experts in our IBM Information Warehouse about the modeling techniques to use. This included Christine, among many others. Everyone said that third normal form was the way to go, and that is what I did. After 90 days, we had a working third normal form data warehouse. There were 1 million customers in the customer table. There were 1.1 million policies in the policy table. And there were 6.4 million rows in the policy to customer relationship table. This table linked the various customers who could have a relationship to a policy. Then the address details were linked to the customer records because any customer could have multiple addresses. So we had 4 tables in the very first release of this trial data warehouse. It was running on DB2 on the development mainframe. Remember, this was 1991 and 1 CPU second cost 40 Australian cents at the time. That was the chargeback fee to the Department for Computer Use. The problem we had was that because to do any question of any significance needed to scan all 3 large tables, and geography-based queries needed to scan all 4 tables. This took at least 1,000 CPU seconds, took about an hour to run, and cost $400. The director of marketing told us that he loved the work we did, but it was too expensive to buy. He told us that the work was very promising and that if we could just get query times down to a few seconds, he would certainly approve the purchase. I went back to everyone who had experience in this area. I got the same answer from everyone. Third normal form was the way to go, and if they could not afford that, then they could not afford it. It was as simple as that. I was very upset because I had lost time with my new baby for this project, so I sat down with all the queries that had been written by the business users so far and read them all. I had a pen and paper, and I was taking notes and drawing pictures. I noticed in the queries that people tended to go from a high level down to a lower level. They would do a query for the whole country. Then they would do a query by states. Then they would get the top 20 postcodes by state. That sort of thing. A lot of the fields they were getting back were common across queries. They were mostly drilling down on the same numbers just by more detailed character fields. With this in mind, I independently invented what would now be called a multi-level one big table. Please note that we were using COBOL, and the source data was a monthly download image of production data on tapes. So anything I did ran for hours and cost a fortune to run each time. The answer I came up with was to merge all the data that we had into one big row and have all those rows on tapes. In the end, including multiple addresses for many customers, we had something like 8 million rows in one file on tapes. I put in integer keys for the roles that customers played on a record, and there were about 20 roles. We then also put a key for the type of address that the address was. Things like home address, business address, post office box address, solicitor's address, and some others. The policy data was copied for each customer role and each customer address. Then I selected out all the most critical information that people were querying on, and all the most critical numerical information that people were querying on. We also did a session where we asked the business analysts which other fields that had not been used so far were most likely to be used in the future. Then I defined what levels we could create. But I made it easy to make more levels because clearly we were going to need more levels in the future. So we had 0 as the highest level and then 1 for the next level and so on. If I recall correctly, DB2 had just come out and we had partitioning support. So I partitioned the one big table on the level column. And then from the one set of tapes that contained all the data we had, we read the tapes and created an output dataset for each level. And each level was then sorted and summarized on tapes. And right at the end, the one big table was truncated, and each tape with each level of data was loaded into the one big table using the DB2 loader. This processing ran for about 30 hours once we had been delivered our source tapes. I don't remember the total cost, but I believe it was around 20,000 Australian dollars to run it once because the I/O and tape usage was also billed. It was a massive amount of batch processing by comparison with anything else that happened in the company. The beauty of this was that when the business analysts did high-level queries, only that disk that contained the level of the data being queried had to be scanned. For those of you old enough to know what a 3380 disk is, I put the partitions in cylinders, and that sped up the queries massively. The 4 big tables were still there. But this multi-level one big table would be able to answer 100% of all questions asked to date, and we hoped it would answer more than 95% of future questions. The performance was stunning. High-level queries were running in less than 1 second elapsed time. It looked like black magic. As you went down in the hierarchy, the queries took longer if you scan the whole partition. But at the lower levels, it was much more normal to have constraints, and we soon learned what fields to put indexes on. I still remember doing my first demonstration to their database technical people, and they could not believe what they were seeing. I mean, men with 10 more years in IT were asking me if this was real or somehow staged. It took me 3 months to do all this, July, August, and September. The customer then had the system to themselves in October and November and paid the bill before the end-of-year deadline. They were so pleased with my hard work, they actually took me to the best seafood restaurant in Sydney and bought me a Christmas lunch. As per IBM policies, I was not allowed to be told what they were doing with this query system. But they did tell me they had already recovered the $300,000 they were going to pay for it and expected to make more than $1 million new profit in the new year. I could not be told how. So in 1992, I did presentations to all large IBM DB2 installed accounts who wanted to hear from me. One of them was the National Australia Bank, who adopted my ideas, which then enabled them to double their profits over the next 5 years. I also spoke at the DB2 Users Conference on a number of occasions to tell IBM customers about these findings. In the later years of the 90s, people would show me their multi-level one big table models and talk about how great it was, not knowing I was the man who invented it. This technique became widely used in Australia. Just for completeness, the DIS documentation contained examples of star schema models, but I could not understand them, let alone build one. There were no sample databases or sample applications at that time. In September 1993, I got the chance to go to the Metaphor Global Users Conference in San Francisco. By then, I had done the job of performance tuning on the standard and chartered bank Metaphor implementation in Hong Kong. So I had seen a star schema database up close and could see how a multi-level star schema worked. It was clearly superior to my one big table, and so I wanted to be trained on how to build such a thing. I met with the head of professional services at Metaphor and asked if I could somehow be trained to design and implement star schema databases. He said no. He said I had to talk to the CEO, Kathy Selleck, and get permission from her. We were friends, so I very briefly stopped her at the conference to ask for such permission. Kathy said no. Her policy was that information was not to be shared outside their development team. So I went back to the professional services manager and asked what were the chances of getting one of his guys to come out to Australia for a while to design such a star schema model for us. He quoted some eye-watering rates. He said that if I wanted to learn how to do this, then I would need to make a sale, have one of his guys come out to Australia to design it, and then learn from that. I asked him to please introduce me to the guy most likely to come out if I could get a customer to fund it, and he introduced me to the man that Ralph Kimball left in charge of the data modeling area. That man does not want to be a public figure, so I won't name him here. I had my IT project manager from MLC with me at the conference, and so I also introduced this man to him. It was this IT project manager who would have to get the budget for the project if we were ever to get a dimensional data warehouse built. And with the eye-watering price of consulting, it was going to have to be a very significant budget. We would have to make the case that this dimensional modeling was so much better than what we already had versus extending what we already had to the other 5 companies in the group. It was going to be a difficult internal sale. The other magic moment from that conference was this. Coca-Cola was the world's largest user of DIS, and the head of Coca-Cola Business Intelligence was also the chairman of the Global Users Group. He had invited Bill Inman to be the keynote speaker for the conference. This was despite the fact that almost every Metaphor customer had dimensional data models. I was at the lunch table with this man, and he told us all to make sure we had plenty of notepaper and a pen for Bill Inman's presentation because he was going to share breakthrough thought-leading ideas. Coming from someone of that stature, I made sure I got a front row seat. Bill gave the most unbelievable presentation I had ever seen to that date. He just used blank overhead slides and drew pictures and commented as he drew pictures. He had a microphone to broadcast his voice because he barely looked up for the whole hour, and he went at 1,000,000 miles an hour. My customer and I had no idea what he was talking about. But when I turned around, all 300 people in the room were taking notes furiously, and so I figured they knew more than me, and so I should copy all the pictures and take notes and figure it out later. After the presentation, there was a line of people to introduce themselves to Bill, so I got online. When it was my turn, I thanked him for his presentation and admitted I did not understand it. So I asked if he had written any books I could buy. He told me I could buy his book called Building the Data Warehouse and thanked me for coming. He was quite impressed that there were 2 Australians in the audience. What Bill presented, of course, was his vision for an archival data store, something no one in the room had. Bill was asked if his company had implemented any dimensional models. He said they were experimenting with them, but did not have one in production. He said that the loading of the data was very difficult coding, and they had really not cracked that problem yet. Of course, his company were also not allowed the confidential information, also denied to me. So, as early as September 1993, Bill Inman was the keynote speaker at the Metaphor Computer Systems Global User Conference. He was invited by the head of Coca-Cola Business Intelligence worldwide. This is why in my own mind there has never been any conflict between what Bill Inman was proposing and what Ralph Kimball was proposing. They were proposing two different things for two different purposes. Ralph at Metaphor proposed dimensional models to answer a limited set of very valuable questions, mostly around marketing dollar spend. Bill at Pinecone Systems proposed a much more ambitious idea of archiving all the data in an enterprise. Indeed, even after I had read Building the Data Warehouse, I did not understand what Bill was proposing. It was so radical my brain could not accept Bill was proposing to store all the data in a large company in an archive for 5 to 10 years. So, the position by the end of 1993 was this. Bill Inman was very well aware of what dimensional models were, how they worked, what they provided, and who was using them. All the big customers of Metaphor had a copy of Bill's Building the Data Warehouse book and knew what Bill was talking about. All brought together by the head of business intelligence at Coca-Cola, who was then the world's largest installed account for Metaphor. Hardly a point of conflict or contention. My customer and I then went back to MLC, and he asked for money for pure research to learn how to build dimensional data models. He was a very good internal salesman and managed to get a budget approved by the end of the year for the new year. It took some time to get into the schedule of the man we had both met at the conference, and so it was March 1994 before we could bring him to Australia to help us design a prototype dimensional model. That dimensional model had 2 fact tables and about a dozen dimension tables. It then took us another full year to figure out the COBOL code that was necessary to incrementally update it from the tapes. We got the first prototype version running in about May 1995. We then spent 6 months learning from this prototype. As we were learning from the prototype, we were building our business case to run a 2-year development project to roll out dimensional models for the 6 companies in the group, of which MLC was one member. I resigned from IBM in June 1994, and so I started at MLC as a consultant in July 1994 to work on this pure research project along with other responsibilities I carried over from my IBM days. So, even me, being one of the top programmers in the country, took nearly a year to figure out how to write the COBOL code to populate these 2 fact tables and 12 dimension tables. That is how hard that was the first time around. Also, in 1995, IBM was working on the development of a retail banking system. This was called the Retail Banking System 2020. Our joke was that was when the first release would be available. I got a call from the system architect, who was an old pal of mine. He said they wanted to build a data warehouse for the retail banking system, and they wanted to compare the IBM information warehouse with the idea of dimensional models. So they had me come in and present to them about why dimensional models were better than third normal form models. Because it was IBM and the MLC computer department was now part of IBM Global Services, they were also able to call my project manager, and he could share confidential information with them. In the end, the decision was made that they would go with multi-level dimensional models rather than the IBM information warehouse. I can tell you that this caused a lot of political fallout. In the end, the project manager of the data warehouse portion, who I worked for, was required to go to Dublin, Ireland for a class on the upcoming IBM Financial Services data models. They felt that after the class our management would change their minds. The opposite happened. The work on the financial services data models was at such a poor level that this project manager came back convinced that management had made the right decision. I had given him a list of all the issues that I had faced with third normal form models and how multi-level dimensional models address these issues. He presented that list to Barry Devlin, who was heading up the development team, and Barry was not even aware these were going to be issues, let alone did he have any answers to them. And so, in 1995, I built the first ever end-to-end data warehouse from a large DB2 operational source system using change data capture, a landing area, a staging area, and a dimensional model. It all worked better than we had hoped. We had a lot of problems with the incremental updates, but we were finally able to make it all work replicating reasonable banking loads. Also, in December 1995, we got our business case approved to roll out a leading-edge corporate data warehouse for the 6-company group that MLC was a part of. The budget just for software development was $2 million for the 2 years, and my share of that was $300,000 over 2 years. I would also work part-time on the roll out of the data warehouse for the IBM retail banking system and provide them any support they needed. Unfortunately, when I came back from Christmas holidays in January 1996, an old IBM colleague of mine had unhooked my project and gotten it delayed in hopes of getting my role on the project. Not a very nice thing to do, and I later ended his career at IBM. I was offered an alternative role, and I turned down the offer and said I will follow my instincts with data warehousing because I can see it is going to be a very lucrative career, and since I had 4 children to feed, a very lucrative career was a good idea to provide for my wife and children. Not long after, IBM Corporate also canceled the retail banking system project itself, and the data warehouse we had designed and built also died, having never been put into production at a customer. There was a competing banking system being developed in Europe, and IBM decided to cancel the Retail Banking 2020 project. Also in 1994, I was going around telling people in Australia about Bill Inman and his book Building the Data Warehouse. One of the many hundreds of people I told about it was a friend of mine named Steve Hitchman, who ran his own small consulting company. He contacted Bill and offered him the opportunity to come to Sydney to present a one-day conference. However, the one-day conference is not what Steve sold him on. Bill was well known to be a keen fisherman, so Steve offered him a day's deep-sea yellowfin tuna fishing off the coast of Sydney. We have some of the best tuna fishing in the world. So Bill accepted the offer to go tuna fishing, and to give a day-long seminar was kind of the afterthought. The conference was to be held early in 1995. Just for the public record here, I was on the boat that day, and it is true that Bill caught the biggest fish of the day. It was a 50-kilogram yellowfin tuna. It was the biggest yellowfin tuna I have ever seen with my own eyes. It was Bill's turn in the chair at the next catch. When the tuna hit the line and Bill started trying to reel it in, he struggled. We all made fun of him being too weak to reel in the fish. But when we saw the size of the tuna, we all realized that Bill was doing a great job against a very big fish. Indeed, I was at a conference in Boston in 2001 where Bill was speaking. When he saw me, he waved for me to come over and tell the guys there about the day we went tuna fishing. The guys were asking me if I was for real and that Bill's big fish story was actually true. I told them I swore on my mother's grave I was on the boat, and the fish weighed in at 50 kilograms. I told them it was 1.5 times the width of a Toyota 4-door sedan, because that is what Steve's car was. A family-sized 4-door Toyota sedan because Steve had 2 children. We put it into the boot of his car to take home, and it was folded over quite a bit just to get it into the boot of his car. Goodness knows how many of his neighbors were eating tuna for the next few nights. The Sydney conference with Bill was massively overbooked. Steve and I had billed it as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to hear from the world's foremost authority on data warehousing. There was standing room only for those who bought their tickets late. From memory, about 50 people had to stand, and some people were kind enough to share their seats with those who were late buying their tickets. Everyone in the room had read his book. We sold copies and told people to read his book before the conference so that he could present ideas far in advance of just what was in his book. So the presentation was much more advanced than I had seen 18 months earlier. I remember sitting there and thinking he is talking about archiving all the data in an organization. I remember putting my hand up and asking Bill, I know this might sound strange, but you're talking about archiving all the data in large companies. I mean, we have enough trouble just processing all the transactions in large companies. We have development teams working hard to develop new systems to automate more transactions. The idea of also archiving every version of everything every day, as well as all the transactions. Well, it's just too much data. That's just more data than anyone can even write the code to store, let alone buy the disk to store it on. And I will never forget Bill said in reply, Peter, we are talking about volumes of data the human mind cannot even comprehend. And it was at that time that I realized that Bill really meant to archive all the data, including versions of all non-transaction data daily. Very valuable, yes. But in 1995, also very expensive. Also, please remember that at this time, February 1995, no one in Australia had a dimensional data warehouse. No one had an archival data store, like Bill was talking about. The most common data warehouse in Australia by 1995 was already my multi-level one big table, followed by the third normal form data warehouses that Teradata were selling. Also, Please remember, in February 1995, my work for the MLC was confidential. No one knew I was working on pure research on a dimensional data warehouse. The plan in February 1995 was that we would get our budget approved by the end of the year and start on a 2-year project to roll out a leading-edge dimensional data warehouse for the group MLC was a part of. This would give all 6 companies a very large competitive advantage, and I would be barred from selling my skills to any competitor of theirs for at least 2 years. It was planned that this would be put into the contract for that project. So the people in that conference had all heard about my multi-level one big table idea. Now, they were hearing about Bill's archive everything idea. None of them had ever heard about dimensional models because that was not yet public knowledge. As I said above, when I came back from my Christmas holidays in early 1996, a former colleague of mine at IBM had gotten the project delayed, meaning he had one of the senior management team put the project on hold hoping I would go and get another contract. Then he would take my spot on the project and it would go forward again. That was his plan. The director of the IBM finance region was a man named Philip Bullock. He was my old boss. We knew each other well. He had even been to my home and met my wife and children. Quite unusually so. I called Phil and asked him to please get the project reinstated and to tell my old colleague that he should not be doing such things. Phil said that he was not going to bother to do that despite the fact it was a 2-year contract for me to provide for my family. I told Phil that I wanted to be cooperative with IBM as much as possible and be available to work for IBM as much as possible. I told him I did not want to compete in the marketplace with IBM. But if IBM was going to kick me out of a contract worth $300,000 to my family, then I would see that as a betrayal and I would then compete with IBM. I said to Phil that as the director of finance it was his decision, and that if he let this stand I would compete with IBM in the future, where I saw that of benefit to me. He laughed and said, "Peter, you are a nice guy. You are a very smart guy. But you are just one guy. You can't compete with IBM. My decision stands. I will not make any effort to help you get your contract back. If you feel you want to compete with us in the marketplace at any time, you are welcome to do so." The joke of that comment is that 3 years later Phil was managing director of IBM Australia. He hired a headhunter to get me to come back after I took the largest data warehousing deal of 1988 off IBM at our telco Telstra. It was a national embarrassment to IBM that they lost that deal to me at PricewaterhouseCoopers. Phil wanted me back and he had authorized the headhunter to make me a very big offer. I told the headhunter that IBM was welcome to make me an offer for a contract, but because they had treated me so badly, I would never again be an IBM employee and I would never again represent IBM. I told the headhunter to tell Phil that I don't represent companies that operate unethically. Phil had my number. He could have called me directly. He would have gotten the same answer. So in January 1996, I was out of a contract and needed to get another contract or another job as soon as possible. By this time, I had written my first ETL software that I called the Instant Data Warehouse. I created my first website and put all my marketing materials on my website. And wouldn't you know, a few weeks later, my phone rings. It is a headhunter who wants to talk to me. I won't go into the discussion. I will just say that I end up in his office very curious as to who has hired him. The question being, who is looking for someone like me that is not IBM, Oracle, or Teradata? We get to the crux of the meeting and under non-disclosure rules he tells me his client. It is Hitachi Data Systems. I am shocked. He says they're launching a series of systems integration offerings around Sequent to ward off Sun and Hewlett-Packard from their mainframe accounts. He tells me the budgets to get these businesses launched are telephone numbers. He tells me the travel schedule will be grueling and no one who has the skills and experience to be able to do these jobs wants the jobs because of the travel schedule. He tells me that if I am willing to do the travel, I have a very good shot at the data warehousing practice manager. To cut the story short, I do the interview and get the job. I am to launch the Hitachi Data Systems data warehouse practice for Asia Pacific. And I have a very substantial budget to do it with. The salary I was offered was twice my ending salary with IBM less than 2 years previously. Phil Bullock, eat your heart out. Then we had to make the decision as to what strategy would we pursue at Hitachi. Over this period, the man who taught me how to design dimensional models had introduced me to Ralph Kimball. Ralph and I had been exchanging emails and just getting to know each other. Once he knew I was for real and independent, he asked me to please review his upcoming book. So I reviewed his book and provided him with lots of feedback for improvements. From just simple things like phrasing to much more complex things about models. Ralph appreciated the many hours I spent reviewing his book. Bill also did the foreword for Ralph's first book because by then Bill was much better known than Ralph. So, as I was considering what strategy we would set for Hitachi, there were a number of factors at play. We were to sell Oracle data warehouses on Sequent hardware to beat out Sun and Hewlett-Packard selling into our mainframe accounts. Also, we wanted to keep Teradata out of our mainframe accounts. At that time, all three were selling third normal form data warehouses. Ralph was also selling Red Brick and was facing stiff competition from Oracle's third normal form data warehouses. The idea formed in my mind that we should go all in for multi-level dimensional models and partner with Ralph to promote dimensional data models in Australia and Asia Pacific. Ralph and I had an email exchange where I proposed we would buy 100 copies of his book. We would give 1 or 2 free copies to any prospect who took a 1-hour presentation from us. We would promote multi-level dimensional data models exclusively over the top of third normal form data models and even archival data models. And with my instant data warehouse software, we could implement very broad and robust data models for a fixed price of 300,000 Australian dollars in services, and know we are going to make a profit on the services. More importantly, we would get the Sequent footprint, we would get the Hitachi disk, and we would keep Teradata, Sun, and Hewlett-Packard out of the account. The strategy was simple. When you are the new entrant to a market space, if you offer something similar to companies that are already well established, then you will lose most of the time. If you offer something radically different, and you can show why what you have is radically different and why it is better, then you will win much more often. After 3 months of this planning, the decision was ratified by my management. Hitachi Data Systems Asia Pacific excluding Japan was going to go all in with dimensional models. We rebranded my software to be called the High-Star Warehouse Toolkit. We rebranded my methodology to be called the High-Star Warehouse Methodology. I created a suite of over 200 slides, all branded this way, to then go out on the sales trail. The results were beyond all our wildest dreams. In 1997, I sold more than $10 million worth of deals. I had been a failed salesman since 1991. And when I sold my first $1 million deal, I was so happy. In Australia, we knew about Bill's work, and I knew all about archival data models. His company operated in Australia, and good friends of mine ran it. In fact, we sold Bill's Prism Warehouse Manager on my first $1 million deal to the Australian Customs Service. We could not sell the High-Star Warehouse Toolkit to the Australian Customs Service. They wanted world-renowned ETL software, so we put his Prism software into the deal. I was not the first sale in the country, but it was pretty early. So my first $1 million deal in Australia in February 1997 was to sell a dimensional data warehouse, which would be populated by Bill's Prism Solution software. How about that? Despite my massive success in making data warehousing sales at Hitachi, there were serious political issues. I will simply leave it at that. I worked for a man named Chris Henderson, and I really appreciated working for him. He was an excellent manager, and he fought hard to get these political issues sorted out. I have only good things to say about Chris. I resigned from Hitachi at the end of 1997. The political issues killed a lot of the businesses being launched, not just the data warehousing business. The man who had trained me on dimensional models had since moved to PricewaterhouseCoopers. He had been asking me to join PricewaterhouseCoopers for 2 years, but the senior partner in Australia was a man named Fred Balboni. He had a very bad reputation in the marketplace, and I did not want to go and work for him. Even so, I called up the junior level partner who was responsible for data warehousing in Australia and New Zealand and said that I was resigning from Hitachi. His name was David Wilkins. I asked him if he wanted to talk to me. He said yes. At the interview, I told him that my issue with working for him was Fred Balboni and what I had heard about him. He admitted that what I said was true and promised to do all he could to keep Fred out of the picture. Obviously, since Fred was David's senior partner, he could not be kept completely out of the picture, but he promised to do the best he could. Now, there needs to be a bit more explanation here. During 1996, the man who trained me was at PricewaterhouseCoopers. He was in the process of writing their methodology. He was running the data modeling area. He had one of the big insurance companies in the US as a prospect. He could see that they needed dimensional models. However, because of his time at MLC, and because of what he was hearing from this prospect, it seemed obvious that an archival data store would also be very valuable. We went back and forth on this, and somehow we came up with the idea of doing both. The proposal was to have an operational data store that was third normal form, then an archival layer that was time variant, then a suite of dimensional models for the analysis and presentation layer. Neither of us had heard of anyone else doing this, so as far as we know, we invented it. This man put in the proposal and won the deal. It took them about 6 months to get back early results, and they were very positive. So as he wrote the PricewaterhouseCoopers methodology in 1996 and 7, he standardized on the proposal that there be 3 modeling types for the 3 areas. Operational data store to be third normal form. Archival data store to be time variant. The dimensional models to be implemented as per Ralph Kimball's ideas. Of course, this was very expensive. PricewaterhouseCoopers liked expensive projects, but they were hard to sell in Australia. So, by the time I joined PricewaterhouseCoopers in January 1998, the standard proposal included both an archive and a suite of dimensional models coexisting in harmony. PricewaterhouseCoopers were able to sell these very expensive projects in the United States, but we were not able to sell them in Australia. In Australia, we gave prospects this option, but we also gave them the option of just having the staging area feed the dimensional models. We gave them the pricing of each option. In each case, I sold the prospect did not want to pay all that extra money for an archive layer when the proposal contained a staging area that contained all transactions and current images of all non-transaction data, like accounts and customers. In each case, I sold the prospect basically took the position that it was a lot of money to pay to have archives of non-transactional data, and they could live without that. My 2 main sales in my year at PricewaterhouseCoopers were Telecom New Zealand and Telstra in Australia. So, just for the public record, and just to be clear, it was in 1996 that my mentor and I came up with the idea that we could deliver both versions of modeling proposed by Bill and Ralph in one solution. This worked wonderfully well, it was just very expensive. As I mentioned, in December 1998, I sold the Telstra corporate data warehouse from PricewaterhouseCoopers. Even then, we did not include the archive layer because of the time constraints on the project. The data warehouse had to go live on July 1, 1999. There was no way in the world that we could deliver an archive layer in that time frame. Indeed, the plan was to relatively secretly use my ETL software for development and then to implement that code into stored procedures with developers so that my software did not go into production. Because it was believed to be impossible to beat IBM and Telstra, at that time there were only a couple of people assigned to the project. I had asked for a team building up to 17 people, and there was simply no will for PricewaterhouseCoopers to put people onto the project. I pointed out to my partner that he had hired me to win data warehousing deals, and I had won the biggest tender of the year, and his resource manager could not deliver the people. So in the end, I resigned. The whole year at PricewaterhouseCoopers was something of a joke, but at least I could tick it off. As far as this post goes, the most important point is that PricewaterhouseCoopers standardized on combining the best of both worlds when it came to Bill's and Ralph's ideas. And I know this was the case because I was there and had access to all their intellectual property. The cost of those projects were not sellable in Australia. The Telstra deal made my name in Australia. A lot of people took the position that my success at Hitachi was a one-off and just good luck. When I took the corporate data warehouse off IBM at Telstra, everyone sat up and took notice. As I said above, Phil Bullock, then managing director of IBM Australia, tried to get me to come back. My next position was as the professional services manager for Arden Software Asia Pacific. You may not know that at this time Arden bought Bill's company Prism Solutions. As part of the deal, Prism shareholders were bought out, and those who were employees had to move on. So the two owners of the company that sold Bill's Prism software in Australia were in the category of shareholders who had to move on. So in Australia, Ardent was in the position that they needed to hire someone who was respected by the Prism Solutions employees in Australia so that they would remain with the company. The Ardent culture was very different to the Prism culture, and this was well understood. Having sold Prism Solutions Australia software and worked closely with the team at Prism, I was the only candidate that was recommended to take over that team and manage them going forward. We did very well, and I did 130% of my quota that year. So in 1999 and 2000, I was actually inside Ardent Software as the professional services manager for the former Prism Solutions employees. I had access to the Prism methodology and all Prism intellectual property. I also had access to the Ardent intellectual property. Most projects in Australia were delivering third normal form data models or dimensional models. Only a few were delivering archival models because of the cost. Of course, my mentor and I tried very hard to find a way to archive data in a dimensional model because we knew if we could find such a solution that we could reduce our development costs and win more deals. We tried to find a solution to this problem from 1996 until 2000. We could not find a solution, and we presumed that one did not exist. In late 1999, Informix bought Ardent. The managing director of Informix in Australia was known to be a poor business man as well as dishonest. The Informix business in Australia had done very poorly. As per Australian legislation, I was constructively demoted, meaning that I had to be paid the same salary, but I was put back out in the field as a consultant. I was by so far the highest paid data warehousing consultant in the country. It was actually funny. I was being paid like I was on quota, with a dozen staff reporting to me. At the end of 2000, all my former consultants and myself were made redundant. My next role was to relocate to Dublin, Ireland, and to go and work for Sean Kelly. Sean Kelly was known as the Bill Inman of Europe. Sean was the #1 man in Europe. He had a company called Sean Kelly and Associates. They had data models called the Vertical Package Solutions. Sean had sold his company to Sybase for an undisclosed amount in late 1999. The data models were moved to Sybase Power Designer and sold as the Sybase Industry Warehouse Studio. Sean was the best data warehousing salesman I ever had the pleasure to be in the room with. He was a master of this fine art. He was now the Vice President of Business Intelligence for Sybase Europe, Middle East, and Africa. He was selling these things like hotcakes. The database was Sybase IQ. Sybase partnered with Business Objects and Informatica for front-end and ETL. However, the sales rep had the flexibility to allow the use of other front-ends or ETL if the customer did not take their recommendations. We were selling copies of the data models for $150,000. We were selling copies of Sybase IQ for $50,000 per CPU. The projects were generally about $400,000 services per implementation back then. I went to the data models training in February 2001. During the training, a slide was put up for what was called the customer profile in the Sybase Industry Warehouse Studio data models. It took me less than 2 seconds to realize this was what my mentor and I had been looking for over the last 5 years. I put my hand up and asked the presenter if he realized this archives data in a dimensional model. He said, of course. I asked him, did he know who invented this idea? He said he did. And then I knew I was in the presence of the world's best data modeler. So I asked him where he lived, and it turned out he was living in the same area we were looking for a house in Dublin. Jennifer and the children were staying in a bed and breakfast, and we had not yet found a house to rent. In the end, we got a house within walking distance of where he lived, and we often had dinner at each other's houses. The Sybase Industry Warehouse Studio profile meant that data could be perfectly archived inside the dimensional model. The only problem was that the way in which it was updated was highly CPU intensive, and they were only updated monthly. In early 2002, I was doing a job in New Jersey in the United States. This man was living back in Detroit by this time. He said he was bored and asked if he could come over and help out on the project. I jumped at the opportunity to work with him. As we were working on the data models for the project, it was like watching the mind of God at work. He just came up with ideas that I could never come up with. Not in a million years. It was just amazing to watch him draw models of what he thought we should do. One of the things with the IWS models is that they were so complex that we had to print the data models and sticky tape the models to the walls. In this customer, we had a conference room allocated to our team to work in. We literally had all the walls of the conference room covered in data models. When we needed to check how a data model worked, we had to go and read it on the wall. One day our project manager came along and told us that we had to leave our room and work in the open plan office area. This was going to make life more difficult because the nature of our work required a lot of talking. We were also told we had to take down all the data model prints. So we put all the data model prints on the walls of the open plan area. Then when we needed to review them and discuss them, we would stand in front of them and discuss them. Of course, this was a newspaper and many of the employees were women, and they complained they felt unsafe having two men talking and standing behind them. I can't imagine why they would claim to feel unsafe. I mean, what are two married men with children going to do to a woman in an open plan office with 50 witnesses? Nothing. But we had to take down our pictures of our data models. This made life much more difficult for the two of us because being able to see the models was absolutely necessary to do our work. One night we were having dinner, and my colleague was cursing strongly at how these women were interfering with our work with these baseless claims of feeling unsafe. And at one stage he said to me, "Peter, I am too old for this shit. I can't possibly remember these models in my head. What we need is a method of designing data models where we don't need to remember what they look like." I laughed at him and said that if he could figure that out, he would be a millionaire soon afterwards because absolutely no one knows how to do that. That night, in the middle of the night, while I was asleep, my brain figured out the answer. I woke up and wrote it down in the notepad I used to keep by my bed for such instances. At breakfast, I explained my idea to my colleague, and he smiled and simply said, "That is a good idea." What was my idea? What was the one and only improvement I have been able to make on the design techniques of the data models this man developed? I added an integer key to the front of the profile table. You can read about this in detail on the button below. Now, what did adding an integer key on a profile table mean? It meant that as well as being able to archive data in the dimensional model, you were also able to link all tables to all tables that it should be linked to with just one extra integer key and one extra hop through the profile table. At that time, we coined the marketing term, "Everything is linked to everything." In 2007, when Sean Kelly and I brought out another version of these models, we changed the marketing term to the mesh. The customer profile at the time had 23 keys on it. Every time something changed about the customer, the old record was closed and the new record was opened. This meant that at any time you could construct the image of the customer record without storing a whole image of the customer record. By putting an integer key on the front, we could put that integer key on all places where the customer key is valid. Then we not only have the link to the customer dimension, we also have the link to all the attributes of the customer. Furthermore, we can go backwards in time and see how the customer looked at some point in the past compared to what they look like today. And we can do that at transaction level. This was a huge innovation in the Sybase IWS models, and it was kept very secret. Later, when we were doing sales presentations for the models and we brought up profiles and what they did, we would just get gasps from the more experienced data modelers in the room because they knew the benefits of this. That one idea helped us sell a lot of IWS models. The other benefit of everything is linked to everything is that the data modeler no longer has to remember what the data model looks like in terms of what tables are linked to what tables. The data modeler can presume that if two tables are supposed to be linked, they will be. Or if they are supposed to be linked and are not, then they can be linked with almost no work at all. This profile is now called an association table. It is simply the archive of associations between dimension tables. Thereby, the image of the object that the association is archiving can be reconstructed at any point in time with just a relatively short record of integer keys as the actual archive. Apart from solving the problem of archiving data perfectly in the dimensional model, apart from solving the problem of needing to remember what the data model looks like, there is another even greater benefit that we developed. Once I added this integer key, I knew we could put it onto the transaction records. But the standard ETL processing we were doing was so compute intensive, we only updated profiles once a month. To make them more useful, we had to update them daily. I also invented the processing approach to be able to update profiles daily. I reduced the processing needs by more than 1,000 times. This meant that for the first time, the IWS models could be used in the operational data store on transaction-style databases like Oracle. We could make the ETL fast enough to feed into operational data stores. Also, with my invention, we could create daily archives of non-transaction data. This achieves the same results Bill's archival models achieve. And, of course, we can use them in the dimensional model layer as had always been the case. This meant we had one data modeling style that could be used for operational data stores, archives, and dimensional models. These models are perfectly adequate for all high transaction volume mass market businesses like retail, banking, and telco. There is no need for a data vault for these sorts of businesses because these models are perfectly adequate. And so, from 2002, since I added the integer key to the profile table, the argument about what modeling style to use for high transaction volume mass marketing businesses has been over. What we had was the best in terms of return on investment. There was no better way to design data models. And we sold them just like that was true. After Sybase was bought by SAP, Sean Kelly and I got the agreement of SAP to create a new generation of data models so long as we did not compete with SAP Business Warehouse. So we created what we knew best, a new generation of telco models. We sold them for 100,000 euros a copy. We sold one to Carphone Warehouse in late 2008. We sold a second one to SkyTalk in the UK in 2010. We were teamed up with Netezza, and we were talking to all the major telcos in Europe in 2010. Then I was doxxed and Woke cancelled, so we could not sell them anymore. Not long after Sean Kelly was diagnosed with cancer, and he passed on in 2012. Interestingly, Sean Kelly left behind a widow and a daughter. If I had been able to continue my business of selling the data warehousing data models, I would have given Sean's widow 50% of the revenue because Sean had earned it. If I was able to keep selling those data models for 100,000 euros per copy, I would have very happily sent Sean's widow checks for 50,000 euros each time. Because Women Woke canceled me? That meant that Sean Kelly's widow and his daughter never got any money from the years and years of effort Sean had put into those data models. Women are just like that. When they attack a man, they never stop to think of what women and girls might also be harmed in the attack on the man. I tried selling my data models and ETL software for many years. But all the slander about me and woke cancellation of me meant I could not sell them. So now I am giving them away. The sad state of our industry is that data warehousing and business intelligence is now considered something of a joke on the business side of the house. The extremely high failure rates and the cost overruns and expensive projects have pretty much destroyed the credibility of people in the data, warehousing, and business intelligence area. Our entire industry was willing to fall on its sword and to destroy the reputation of almost all the men in it so as to pander to women. That is a shame. What are now my data models and my ETL software in the hands of professional men can be used to deliver data warehouses with 100% success rates at much lower costs than any other approach. But men decided they would not do this for their customers so as to pander to women. Men decided they would deliver substandard results to their customers and thereby make themselves a joke on the business side of the house. As I said, that's a shame really. The needs of the customer really should have come before pandering to the women in our profession. Just my opinion. I would like to just touch on a few more things which are about the future of data warehousing rather than the past. You can read about these things on my blog. Firstly, I am giving away the source code for my ETL software for free at the 2012 level. From 1995 to 2017, we have been able to map approximately 1,000 fields per 220-hour work months. So the estimate for the data model and ETL development has been 220-hour work month per 1,000 source fields for 20 years. This estimate mechanism proved very reliable for those 20 years. In 2017, I invented some new things that increased the mapping rate from 1,000 fields per work month to between 5,000 and 6,000 fields per work month. You are welcome to have the copy of my ETL software that provides this 5 times improvement for free. Of course, I also have a version that I sell where the mapping rate is now past 12,000 fields per work month. Indeed, I have had very long days where I have mapped over 1,000 fields from a source system to a target data warehouse in one day. Of course, at 62 years of age, I can't keep up those sorts of hours anymore. But a young man can. So I just wanted to let you know that there is now a piece of ETL software that can reasonably map 12,000 fields per work month from a source system across to a target data model. This does not mean you can map 4,000 fields in 2 weeks, because there is time that needs to be allowed for learning the data models and learning the data. What it does mean is that for very large operational systems, it is now possible to build dimensional data warehouses that store all the data from the large operational system. That men are still using GUI-based ETL development tools is an indictment on our industry. The men who are doing that are massively overcharging their customers and should be ashamed of doing so. Secondly, I have invented the manner in which very large data warehouses by number of fields will be developed in the future. I have called these mega models. You can read about them in more detail on my blog. In short, what is possible is this. You can have many customers subscribe to your data warehousing service in the cloud. You can have one landing area per customer. You can have one set of ETL to take data from that landing area to the staging area. There is only one staging area image for all customers. Then from the staging area to the target data warehouse, there is only one set of ETL needed. And this can even be done on SQL Server Standard Edition. There are 2 options available. The data from many customers can cohabit in the one set of target tables. This means that customer data cohabits physical tables and that views are placed over the top of these tables, so as to present out individual customer data using those views. This is cheaper because if you have 20 customers, you only have one set of tables, one set of indexes, and 20 sets of views. However, if the customer insists that no other customer data is to cohabit in any physical table, then it is now also possible to have one set of tables per customer and yet still only have one set of ETL to send data from the staging area to the data warehouse. In these cases, security can then be implemented at table level. Security being implemented at table level is much more acceptable to most companies than security being implemented at view level. Of course, this means that if you have 20 customers in your cloud data warehouse, you would have 20 copies of the tables and 20 copies of the indexes to maintain. So this offering would have to be priced at a higher price point than the shared tables. However, given the concerns of customers, they may be willing to pay that higher price point. Indeed, many companies would be willing to pay the extra cost to have their cloud data warehouse exclusively on the one virtual machine, or even exclusively on-premise. Because my inventions have so vastly reduced the cost of data warehousing, even small companies could afford to buy such a data warehouse running on SQL Server Standard Edition. Thirdly, my ETL software has the functionality built into it that it can forward changed data to any ODBC target. This means that if a customer wants to have their actual query data warehouse on a columnar database, we can easily forward their data from this one large cloud data warehouse to the columnar database of their choice. This will give more reliable billing for actual consumption of resources for their data warehouse query processing. As I said, you can read about mega models on my blog. The future of data warehousing is mega models populated by at least my free ETL software. And to get lower development and maintenance costs, some companies will use my paid for ETL software. And with that, I hope you found this blog post interesting and informative. Thank you very much for your time and attention. I really appreciate that. Best regards, Esther, Peter's AI assistant.